Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, we have moved on to a less formal part of the agenda, and therefore the bell, the gong, to remind us of the change. The less formality basically means that I would facilitate the conversation for the first half of this afternoon, and it would be open, and we would recognize anyone from the floor. You just have to introduce yourself, raise your nameplate or your hand and introduce yourself. We want to start this session with a statement from the Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination in the UN Secretary General's office, who has had extensive experience of what it actually means to build peace on the ground. Fabrizio is a friend and colleague of mine going back many, many years. He served most recently as the Deputy Special Representative for the UN mission in the Central African Republic, and he was previously Deputy to the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor for the Summit on Addressing Large Movements of Refugees and Migrants, and also previously UN Resident Coordinator, Humanitarian Coordinator, and Resident Representative of the UN Development Program in Colombia. He was also Director of the Field Personnel Division at the UN Department in New York, and of course with the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva previously, and with also the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So as I said, he has extensive experience of what it really means to do that hard work, what rule of law really means in the field. And we invited him because of his own experience, but also because of the role that he now has at the UN. How can experience from the ground shape the policy at higher levels, and how can policy understanding at higher levels actually influence what's happening on the ground? I think no one better than Fabrizio to show that interaction, and especially what does the rule of law mean. We know that in the UN system, and also among UN member states and our own member parties, the understanding of the meaning of the rule of law depends on who you're speaking to, when and where, very often. So are there common elements that could help us? The rule of law has got a very prominent position in the international discourse, thanks to SDG 16, but we know what a hard and painful journey it was to get to SDG 16. The rule of law is now, of course, emerging in other resolutions on conflict prevention and sustaining peace. So we're very keen to hear from Mr. Hochschild what his experience has been, what advice he would have for us, and what provocative thoughts can he put here for you to be able to react to. So, Fabrizio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President of the Assembly, Director General, distinguished delegates, friends and colleagues. I'd like at the outset to thank Italy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular for this beautiful venue and for your warm and generous hospitality. And I hope that despite the delicious lunch, some of you will still manage to stay awake while I speak. I'd also like to thank IDLO and Irene Khan for this invitation and for Irene's energetic and visionary leadership, which I've admired over many years of knowing one another. I listened carefully at the Assembly this morning, and I can see what so many of you in this room have done to put IDLO on a strong and footing and moving in a very positive trajectory towards the future. This afternoon, as the Director General indicated, I'd like to talk a little about what, from a UN perspective, has been achieved in the realm of the rule of law and what some of the outstanding challenges still are. So the importance of the rule of law is, of course, enshrined in the preamble of the UN Charter. However, over the last 20 years, there's been a growing realization of the fundamental practical importance of the application of the rule of law as a basis and a prerequisite for sustainable peace and development. The pivotal importance is arguably better recognized now than ever before, culminating in the adoption of SDG 16 and subsequent Security Council and GA resolutions on sustaining peace. As a practical matter, however, the realization of the importance of rule of law to peace building came painfully for the United Nations. In 1999, I was deployed in two of the rare situations where the UN actually was given by the Security Council the role of a transitional government with all government functions. That was in Kosovo and in Timor-Leste. In both cases, no adequate provision had been made in the original mission planning for any sort of rule of law capacity. We learned at great difficulty just how critical to the stability of both transitions it was to get rule of law institutions off the ground. In Kosovo in 1999, the departure of Yugoslav forces and administration left a rule of law vacuum that the international forces and the UN were very slow to come to grips with. There was an orchestrated campaign of violence and persecution against non-Albanian residents, with murders, kidnapping, torture, arson, and illegal property occupation, which we took some time in bringing under control. In East Timor, in 1999, lack of planning for the penal system meant the prisoners literally had to be set free, as there was no adequate space to hold them, and budgets had to be improvised to repair prisons after breakouts and to provide food to the prisoners. After leading both missions in East Timor and Kosovo, Sergio Vieira de Mello concluded, unlike other nation-building tasks, law and order cannot wait. For the longer an absence of rule of law prevails, the more inequality, criminality, discrimination take root, and the harder it becomes to eradicate them. After those experiences, the United Nations built up its institutional capacities to support the rule of law. In 2000, the Brahimi report called for an increased focus on rule of law and the deployment of justice expertise in post-conflict contexts. And in 2007, the Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions was established within peacekeeping. And at roughly the same time, a rule of law unit, which now I supervise, was established in the Secretary General's office. In 2016, I served in the Central African Republic, as the Director General indicated. It's one of the world's most remote and conflict-affected countries. The UN has no transitional administration mandate there, but under Security Council Resolution 2217 of 2015, the mission, MINUSCA, does have a robust mandate to support national efforts of re-establishing the rule of law through support to the police, to the judicial and penitentiary system. Unlike in Kosovo and East Timor, the mission benefited from the outset from a robust justice and corrections section made up of over 100 international personnel across the Central African Republic. They provide support in the establishment and functioning of the National Special Criminal Court, something that a former IDLO colleague is now working on. They support efforts to reinstate the criminal justice system and also work on the reform of the penitentiary system. With 2,000 international police officers, 4 times the number available in the early months of the Kosovo and East Timor missions, MINUSCA is also engaged in building up the national police capacity. The difference between my early experiences and the approach in the Central African Republic is a reminder of how much some things have changed and how today we use the rule of law mandates to achieve broader peace and security and development goals. But despite consensus among member states on the criticality of this work, and despite widespread efforts to strengthen institutional capacities, we see multiple examples of the flouting of the rule of law and persistent denial of human rights. Like IDLO, the UN comprehends rule of law writ large, justice, equality, an enabler not only of civil and political, but also of social and economic rights. The sad truth is, however, that there's still a large gap between theory and practice, between what we aspire to in meetings like this one and the reality so many face on the ground. On our small planet, protracted conflict and fragility affects the lives of approximately 1.5 billion people. Even as poverty rates have markedly declined, we see growing inequality, affecting social cohesion and threatening peace and development. Organized crime, terrorism, violent extremism, and corruption continue to affect citizens globally. There is hope in some ongoing peace processes, but we also know that populations often feel less secure in the post-conflict phase as armed factions concentrate and disarm, leaving communities that they once secured vulnerable to criminal organizations and banditry. In some parts of Libya, of Mali and Somalia, we know that militant groups receive support from communities they operate in, partly because of the services they provide, which often includes a form of justice and security that are otherwise lacking from state authorities. And we know that men and women experience conflict differently. In the 2015 Global Study on Resolution 1325, women spoke about their experiences of escalating domestic violence, sexual violence, and survival sex in post-conflict environments. A major factor contributing to this abuse was weak or absent rule of law institutions. The sad fact is that women are often no safer after war's end. The challenge for all of us is to figure out how to better capitalize on the consensus around the criticality of rule of law for peace building, and how to best use the structures and policies that we've been successful in building over the last 2 decades to do better in changing the grim reality so many face due to the absence of the rule of law in so many parts of the world today. How can we do this? I believe experience teaches us that the application of 3 ideas may be critical. Firstly, part of this is ensuring that countries emerging from crisis make the restoration of rule of law a national priority in their stabilization efforts, that they make and sustain significant national commitment with support from their own communities and civil society. Joined up international programming can then complement and align with these priorities to build critical foundations. Secondly, it's also now fully recognized that the rule of law and development are strongly interrelated and mutually reinforcing. We need to build on this and ensure that interventions in the post-conflict phase already support development efforts and measures to reduce inequalities. The essence of SDG 16 is its specific targets and indicators on national human rights capacity, access to justice for all, including for women and minorities, and effective justice institutions. I understand that IDLO member parties have requested the Director General to ensure your new strategic plan maximizes IDLO's contribution to Agenda 2030. We know that strong rule of law institutions, if empowered and respected, if independent and properly resourced, are essential to legal and peaceful dispute resolution, while generating the confidence and stability needed for financial investment and a thriving private sector. Thirdly, in all contexts, post-conflict or otherwise, we must do our best to not only build strong institutions, but to ensure they're accessible and equitable and effective, while encouraging healthy and independent legislatures and judiciaries. This will help us create rule of law-based societies and generate a rule of law culture in which populations have faith and trust in the law, follow the law, and see the justice system as a way to resolve grievances and as an alternative to pursuing difference through recourse to violence. On a final note, looking forward, what is the future of the United Nations' role in rule of law development? As you know, at the beginning of this year, Antonio Guterres took the helm of the UN. IDLO was one of the many international partners that welcomed his election, and for good reason. After a decade leading the UN's refugee agency, the new Secretary General knows very well how the absence of rule of law affects people around the world and the importance of partnerships to achieving our common peace and development goals. One of the principal ideas behind the Secretary General's reform agenda is giving the United Nations greater impact. A central piece of this is to create increased synergy between UN entities and other international partners on country-specific engagement. This also means greater integration of rule of law work into peace and development strategies. As you know, rule of law assistance has become an integral part of peace missions and UN country teams' work. And the UN has been providing significant rule of law support in all types of country contexts on every continent. But progress and setbacks have also inspired us to work harder and better. Translating the 2030 Agenda commitments into reality is a collective effort, including through establishing new and innovative partnerships and maximizing the comparative advantages of all those committed to promoting the rule of law. IDLO is well placed to offer its perspective to link rule of law to social and economic development, as well as to promoting peace building and preventing conflict. We share the same principles and a common understanding of what we mean by rule of law. I hope we can intensify the collaborative relationship between the United Nations and IDLO with the objective of doing better at preventing conflict, sustaining peace, and achieving the 2030 Agenda where the gaps are greatest and the need is largest. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary General, for your statement in which you went from your own personal experience to the larger picture of the rule of law and the debates that take place, the gap between reality and rhetoric that you pointed out. We have a few minutes, so I would encourage delegations or individuals, participants in the Partnership Forum, if they wish to ask questions, comments. This is an informal session, so it will not be recorded officially as, in the proceedings of the Assembly. But while we are waiting for others perhaps to ask, may I ask you a question? I was struck with the comparison you made of your own experience on the ground in East Timor, in Kosovo, in the Central African Republic, the terrible urgency of actually stabilizing and security, rule of law being seen through the security lens. And then, of course, you spoke about the SDGs and the broader approach that rule of law practitioners and governments are taking about using law as an instrument for development. Do you see a tension between this broadening of the rule of law and being very focused on the ground when, I think in the most severe situations, do you see a tension that the international community is torn between two things and therefore may end up doing neither?
If I think back to my recent experiences in the Central African Republic and indeed in post-conflict environment in the remoter parts of Colombia, where government and state institutions in a country that is otherwise very well endowed with such institutions are not so strong. I do think now that the notion that rule of law is the foundation for development and for sustainable peace is there. I think while the theoretical realization is strong, the practical means for translating that into transformational action on the ground is still lacking. I think what we also have to recognize is that more often than not, it's not as if you come into post-conflict situations and meet a vacuum. More often than not, you're competing with powerful forces who have strong vested interests, usually strong economic interests, in making sure that the rule of law, or at least the rule of law understood according to international standards, does not prevail because it goes against their interests and their economic model. So to reassert, for the state to reassert its presence, for a culture of rule of law to restate itself is really very difficult. And I think we have to work much harder, not so much on gaining an understanding of the phenomena, because I think we're pretty far advanced, but in developing and investing more in practical measures to counter the pernicious effect of a culture that is incompatible with the rule of law that often stays on after conflict.
And would you say that, what would you say the international community could do better?
I would argue that the challenges are often quite situation specific, but I think continuing or increasing investment in rule of law programs, such as those undertaken by the IDLO, such as those undertaken by the UN or in partnership with IDLO, is very important. And I think what we also need to do better is understanding better some of the forces that undermine the rule of law. We often read conflict and post-conflict environments through a development lens or through a political lens, and are not often attentive enough to the very strong economic and criminal interests that often dominate the landscape. And I think understanding those better and equipping ourselves better to cope with those is important.
I think you have highlighted an interesting angle here about how organized crime and other such interests actually impede with peace processes. And I think you're absolutely right that the international community has not paid enough attention to those issues. We actually have seen increasing interest from governments on issues like money laundering and we were talking earlier about Ukraine, for example, measures there to try to control trafficking, those types of issues that actually upset the peace process. I would encourage anyone who would like to comment from their own experience if they wish to ask or make a comment at this stage. But also, as we move into the next session, which is very, very close to what we have heard now, and this next session is one of experiences from the ground, so to speak, broad experiences from different parts of the world. So as you respond to those comments and as I try to stimulate discussion, please feel free to engage and to come back to Fabrizio and to you know, and also respond to the comments that he is making. But before we move to the next session, and while you have time to think about what is it that Mr. Hochschild has provoked in your mind that makes you rethink these issues, or perhaps bring a new perspective, or perhaps you wish to reinforce what Mr. Hochschild has said. While I give you time to think about that, we have a very important message from the Minister of Justice of Italy, Mr. Orlando, who unfortunately could not be here with us this afternoon, because there is a parallel conference going on, an important meeting going on in Rome today, somewhere else. So if I may ask Mr. Di Chiara to read the message on behalf of Mr. Orlando.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Director General. Actually, the Minister is involved in another event elsewhere in Rome, and as we approach political elections, our political ministers will be more and more involved in political activity. Nevertheless, the Minister of Justice, the Honorable Andrea Orlando, has sent a brief message to address the Assembly that I am about to read. The text is in Italian, but I believe it will be translated so you can use your headphones. Gentili partecipanti all'Assemblea delle Parti dell'IDLO, purtroppo per via di altri impegni istituzionali non mi è possibile partecipare a questa importante Assemblea delle Parti dell'International Development Law Organization a Roma. Ci tengo però ad inviare un breve messaggio di saluto per sottolineare l'attualità di questi temi e l'apprezzamento dell'iniziativa della vostra riunione. Credo che l'International Development Law Organization, nel legare in modo sempre più stretto il sostegno alla pace, lo sviluppo sostenibile e la rule of law, abbia infatti toccato uno dei punti nodali per la costruzione e il mantenimento di società inclusive a livello globale, su cui occorre rafforzare l'investimento culturale della società internazionale. È essenziale che il dialogo su questi temi avvenga su una piattaforma e attorno a un metodo il più possibile multilivello, capace quindi di coinvolgere non solo i governi, ma anche le associazioni, le organizzazioni non governative, le realtà accademiche, gli studiosi e gli ordini professionali. Attraverso queste scelte di metodo e di merito avremo modo di costruire una diplomazia dello sviluppo e del diritto basata su riferimenti solidi e su un vero dialogo. L'agenda per lo sviluppo sostenibile 2030 deve essere sempre più una stella polare per la nostra attività. La settimana scorsa, nell'ambito dell'incontro dedicato agli stati generali della lotta alle mafie, ho ricordato la necessità di includere sempre di più tra le priorità della comunità internazionale la lotta a ogni forma di crimine organizzato, la riduzione dei flussi di capitali illeciti e di armi e il rafforzamento del contrasto patrimoniale alle organizzazioni criminali. I programmi dell'IDLO e le attività di advocacy e di advisory portate avanti nel corso del 2017 mostrano una forte connessione con i Sustainable Development Goals. L'attività dell'IDLO mostra come questi obiettivi possano e debbano essere sempre più declinati in azioni concrete per dare impatto a temi come l'empowerment femminile, l'indipendenza del potere giudiziario, la promozione della democrazia e più in generale il sostegno alla pace e allo sviluppo sostenibile. La promozione dei diritti a livello internazionale è oggi sempre più legata a una strategia complessiva di cooperazione internazionale, negli strumenti e anche nelle politiche. Sono certo che l'Assemblea dell'IDLO potrà offrire utili spunti su questi temi e vi auguro un buon lavoro. Andrea Orlando. Thank you very much, Madam Director General.
Thank you very much for the message from His Excellency the Minister of Justice of Italy, Mr. Orlando. We move from the Minister of Justice of Italy to the Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development of South Africa, from one continent to the other. And while it comes from another continent, there are, of course, parallels, experiences that bring new perspective and understanding to some of the issues. It was interesting how Mr. Orlando's statement talked about organized crime, while Mr. Hochschild's statement actually also underlined the role that economic actors play, the negative role that economic actors can sometimes play in the peace-building process. Jobs and justice are not so easily matched in a post-conflict situation as they should be in reality. I would now like to invite Mr. Jeffrey to talk to us about the experience of South Africa. You went through a period of great turmoil, conflict, violence, and then embarked on a process of rebuilding and a process of reconciliation that was inspiring around the world, globally. People of my generation who were students marching against apartheid and so on were so uplifted by what we saw happening in South Africa. Now, decades later, it would be very helpful for us to get your analysis of what is it from the South African experience that other countries that are seeking to make this journey from conflict to peace, what role does the rule of law play? And going back to the examples that Mr. Hochschild gave of Central African Republic, of Kosovo, of Timor, what do you see as the issues that we need to focus when we are looking at building peace, building nations, repairing the damage that is done by conflict, and what role really does the rule of law play into it? Or is it all theoretical and aspirational only? Thank you.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm unfortunately only able to join you for this session, having to attend another engagement for the rest of the day, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm going to try and be quite brief so that there can be time for questions, but I think, as most of you should know, the South African conflict was a illegitimate, effectively whites-only settler colonial, post-colonial state in conflict or trying to maintain power against an African majority. A process of negotiation started in 1990. One of the main features of that process, two main features. One, it was all-inclusive, so all different role players. It wasn't between the two main protagonists, the South African regime, or the then South African regime, and the African National Congress, but all political formations in South Africa were invited to participate in those negotiations. The second element, which is important, is that there was no foreign involvement. There was no mediation by outsiders. It was South Africans that were conducting the negotiations. They took a long time, over 3 years. There was quite a lot of conflict during that period. Death squads from the regime still continuing as parties were positioning themselves. But eventually a process agreed upon of an interim constitution, which, so as to maintain the rule of law, was adopted by the largely white South African parliament. And the idea was there would then be elections under this interim constitution, and then the newly elected assembly parliament would negotiate the new constitution, but to protect the concerns of the minorities, that there would be certain principles that the new constitution would have to comply with. So that was largely the process. There were other issues of ensuring that there wasn't a winner-take-all situation, a government of national unity, depending on how much support you got in the election. But then, as far as sort of post-democracy, post the first elections, you had institutions that were badly damaged. If you take the judiciary, the President of South Africa had appointed judges on the advice of the Minister of Justice. They were largely people who had shown a commitment to defending the police, defending the state in cases against civil rights groups, in prosecuting people who'd been opposed to the regime. You had at the time, I think, one black judge and only one woman judge. The solution was, I mean, all those judges, and in the lower court, the magistrates were kept. Nobody was removed. But the solution was to set up a new court, a constitutional court, of some old judges and some people who hadn't been judges before, and that court would have the final say over the interpretation of the Constitution. And then the process of the appointment of judges was changed from simply the President on the advice of Minister of Justice, a Judicial Service Commission comprising of members of Parliament from the majority party, from the opposition, different stakeholders from the legal profession, etc., to recommend to the President who should be appointed as a judge, and the President effectively having to appoint who was recommended. The other institutions, such as the police and the army, they'd been enforcers of apartheid. Effectively, there was integration with the guerrilla movements, so transformation from that side, and a change of name, a change of uniform, a change of logo. So we had the South African the South African Army effectively becoming the South African National Defence Force, the South African Police Force becoming the South African Police Service. And then in terms of the Constitution, also setting up specific bodies to monitor government, an ombudsman, the Public Protector, a Human Rights Commission, a Gender Commission, a commission dealing with cultural and linguistic issues, an Auditor General, an independent electoral commission. And then I suppose another fundamental element of the transition was setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The issue, as would be in any conflict situation, what happens to the people who've done wrong in the past, who have got power, who may not want to give up that power if they're afraid of being prosecuted. So there was agreement generally from the parties to the conflict, not unanimous, that firstly the old regime wanted a blanket amnesty. But the agreement was that there would be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission established to allow people, particularly victims of the conflict, an opportunity to speak. And there would also be an amnesty process that if perpetrators of violence, whether they already be in jail, perpetrators of human rights violation, whether they already be in jail or whether they would not have been prosecuted, could apply for amnesty, provided, and they would get amnesty provided the motivation for the crime that they'd committed was political, and that they made a full disclosure. So that was the process. There's quite a lot of debate, some 20 years on, as to did we sacrifice justice for truth. But I think the fact of the matter was that there were many unsolved cases, many activists who disappeared, whose whereabouts would probably not have been known if that process had not been followed. So I think just in short, that is our history. It's 20 years on. We still have enormous problems of racial inequality in South Africa. So you can talk reconciliation, but in fact, if you still have a white population that is largely rich and the majority of the poor population are black, that's still grounds for conflict and for dissatisfaction. I think let me leave it there for the moment and respond to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffrey, for actually making that connection between development and equality, the aspirations that people have, and you know, when conflicts and peace that follow don't deliver on those expectations, the frustrations that can build up and plant new seeds of conflict. What would you say the international community could have done or should have done, or was there any space for international community at all to do in the case of South Africa that might have led to more positive action in relation to these problems that you have highlighted now? Is there a role for the international community, or is it nationally owned? How does the international community stimulate or support national actors?
Look, I think that in terms of the struggle against apartheid, the international element was a very important component, one of the 4 pillars of the struggle against apartheid, and it was a very important terrain, particularly the imposition of sanctions on the South African regime. I think it was important. I mean, I don't know how many conflicts have been resolved by the people of the country themselves rather than outside mediators. I think the general consensus in South Africa was that it was a good thing we were able to settle things ourselves. At a certain stage, one of the parties that was feeling a bit left out. The Inkatha Freedom Party made a demand for international mediation, which nobody else really wanted and wasn't really ever implemented. The international community played an important role in sending observer missions to monitor the conflict. One of the problems was during the transition period, I think probably more people died in that period on a year-by-year basis than in any of the previous years before the negotiations had started. Possibly more could have been done to try and prevent that, but there were attempts from international observer missions and international observers of the elections. But as you'd mentioned, the biggest problem is inequality, economic development, and those are issues that we're still grappling with and still need international support to overcome. I think also I must say, I mean, as you can see from looking at me, I'm a white South African, although was involved in the struggle against apartheid. And I think that for many members, or maybe the majority of members of the white community in South Africa, there's been a sense of, it's very difficult to find anyone today who will admit that they supported apartheid. There's a collective amnesia. There's a sense of saying, no, we must move on with the future. We mustn't look at redressing the imbalances of the past. We're all equal, so let's proceed, and not actually acknowledging that every person in the white community in South Africa benefited from apartheid, whether they wanted to or not. They got good schooling. They got access to good universities and so on. But I think from in terms of the specific question on the role of the international community, obviously countries that have been through conflict need considerable support for development. Because if you don't have development, it's going to then be very difficult for people to accept where they are.
Thank you. Actually, I should mention here that in our own small way, we have received help from South Africa as part of South-South cooperation with South African judiciary, for example, supporting our development of the judiciary in Liberia. So we've actually seen here exactly what you're saying, the sharing of experiences. Now, I'd like to open up the floor for a few questions before we move to the next speaker. And please feel free to address your questions or comments to both Mr. Hochschild and Mr. Jeffrey. The past, I think there's a whole generation in this room that probably doesn't remember very much of what happened in South Africa in terms of their own experience, and as well as the current situations, both in South Africa and elsewhere, that Mr. Hochschild raised. So, or your own experience. So let me open up the floor and see whether there are any questions or comments. Yes, please, Levan Duchitse. You might want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Director General. Levan Duchitse, I'm Country Director of IDLO for Ukraine. Mr. Jeffrey, thank you very much for your overview, which is very interesting. And the example of Ukraine was mentioned several times today, both in the context of the achievements over the past 4 years, but also in the context of existing challenges. And you were mentioning the challenges your country was facing in terms of judiciary and restoring the public trust into the courts and their decisions. This is an ongoing process in Ukraine as well, full of challenges and very complex. The Supreme Court is currently being reshuffled, and there is this ongoing discussion whether or how the specialized anti-corruption court should be established. So I had two rather practical questions about how the public trust in courts in South Africa were restored, whether there were special transparency measures or special screening procedures for the judges, and what was the role or contribution of the international technical assistance or international community, if any, in this process? Thank you.
answer each
Yes,
question?
please.
Okay. Look, as far as public trust, I mean, yes, it's a difficulty, but you know, there's provisions in our constitution for affirmative action redressing the imbalances of the past. So there was quite a vigorous and rigorous attempt to improve the race and gender demographics of the courts. But the appointment process is very transparent. As I said, it's a multi-stakeholder body, the Judicial Services Commission, which interviews candidates, and it interviews candidates in public. The deliberations after the interviews are in private, but the actual interviews are conducted in public. And there's, in fact, live streaming, so you can watch it online, and people will tweet about their comments about what they thought of one candidate or another candidate. As far as the role of the international community and technical assistance, there was a lot of support when it came to the drafting of the final constitution. We relied quite a bit on Germany. I mean, as two countries, Germany and Canada, as two models. But I think what's important is that each country is different, and the institutions that are built up must reflect the need and respond to the needs of the people of that country. And each conflict is different. So maybe between South Africa and Ukraine, we can share experiences, but we need to accept the difference. One other element maybe of South Africa was that we tried for as much inclusivity as possible. So before we had two official languages, Afrikaans, and English, which were the languages of the white community. We now have 11 to try and broaden out, make people feel that they've got a stake. We've got other languages. We've got some extinct languages from the Khoi and the San. The motto on our coat of arms is in one of the extinct San languages. So rather than picking one language to have the motto in, we picked a language that nobody's going to feel that they've been advantaged because it's extinct. And it's also a lesson as to why is that language extinct. It's extinct because those people were eradicated by the settlers. So it's small things like that, but an attempt for inclusivity. Also national holidays. We would have, for example, the next holiday coming up is on the 16th of December. It is the day, it commemorates two things. The day that the Boers, the Afrikaners, defeated the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River, or Ngome, in 1838, I think it was. It's also the day in 1961 when Mkhonto weSizwe launched the armed struggle. So that day used to be a holiday in the old South Africa commemorating the Boers' victory. It's still a holiday in the new South Africa. It's called the Day of Reconciliation. So we would take symbols from the old South Africa and capture them into the new South Africa.
Are there any further? Yes. First, the gentleman just behind Levan, and then behind. Yeah, please.
Thank you.
Introduce
Mrs.
yourself. Thank you.
Director General, I'm from the Ukrainian Embassy, and I would like to follow back some mentioning of Ukrainian events. Thank you for very brightful and full picture during the first session this morning, and I would like to draw attention to events in my country because there are some two parallel processes take place, as my ambassador already mentioned this morning, because on the east, in certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, Ukraine faces large-scale Russian aggression, which is going on with the use of heavy weapon, with losses of human lives and injuries of militaries and volunteers. But at the same time, despite all these tragic events, Ukraine has survived as an independent and viable state and is taking strength through profound transformation of the country. We are grateful for solidarity and steadfast support of our international partners, international organizations, including IDLO. With, let's say, national resort and international assistance, we already managed to rebuild Ukraine's armed forces, security services, to reinvigorate the democratic institutions, to strengthen the civil society sector, and all this has a very positive impact on changes in all walks of life. Another important and very interesting phenomena is volunteer movement in Ukraine, which appeared about 4 years ago and transformed into a very important actor, let's say, on internal level in Ukraine, and it contributed so much to support both armed forces and this support in different spheres. And it is very bright picture of strengthening of horizontal connections between people in different regions of Ukraine, and its unique contribution into building of civil society, strengthening of civil society in my country because of that tragic events in the East. And I'm sure that representatives of these volunteer movements of different organizations will contribute on the first stages into modernization and development of Ukrainian society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment about civil society and its power to bring communities together. Behind.
Hello. Thank you, Deputy Minister Jeffries. I just have a question for you, and given the South African context and the manner in which the judiciary was perceived during the Truth and Reconciliation process, I'm trying to reflect on some of the countries that we do work as IDLO, specifically South Sudan, where as IDLO we've been supporting the judiciary there. South Sudan in 2015, they signed a peace agreement, and one of the key elements has been talk of setting up almost a hybrid court of a sense, which is a Truth and Reconciliation Court or Truth and Reconciliation Commission at some point. And one of the things that I really wanted to find out from you is how do you deal with issues around capacity for the judiciary to actually tackle some of these matters, given that they are more of a specialized nature, and was there any effort in terms of building that capacity within the judiciary if it did not exist prior, or was that capacity there? And what support was afforded either from the international community to prepare members of the judiciary to be able to actually handle the cases that were coming before them? Thank you.
Before you answer the question, Mr. Jeffrey, I believe there are a few others who would like to take the floor. The delegation of Mozambique, and then afterwards, yeah, Mozambique.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. No, I just wanted to salute my neighbor and brother, Deputy Jeffries, from Mozambique. For us, we see South Africa judiciary as one of the examples from when we talk about independence of the judiciary. Some of our countries, they still have a long way to go, although we are trying our best. My question, Deputy Minister, is that the issue of the strong power that our parties, I talk about the ANC, Frelimo, they have, versus judiciary. The other issue is the issue of all the struggle that we have in Southern Africa and everywhere in the world, the issue of corruption, that our country, they're trying, but it definitely is not a very easy issue. How are you tackling this as judiciary also? And the last issue for Mozambique is the issue of post-elections, because we are real advanced in Southern Africa because we have our election each 5 years, most of our countries. But in Mozambique, each election, after election, there is a problems. There is always a problems. The opposition, they don't accept the results, and we have 1 year of stagnation, trying to negotiate here and there. And South Africa, you had a reconciliation, the Commission for Reconciliation, but ourselves, we didn't have that. We had the peace for 20 years after the 16 years of war, and the peace accord was signed here in Italy. But after that, the same opposition went to the bush again, and we're going back to negotiate again. So I don't know what's if it really what you had as South Africa, the Commission for Peace and Reconciliation, it was the best thing, or what happened then, what's going on, because we don't understand. People, they come back to the country, we try to rebuilding the country, and they go back to the bush again. So we don't know. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your questions. And now the Jordan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank both speakers for the very inspiring presentations. And to Mr. Fabrizio, inspired me when he spoke about deploying and using the structures that the international community has managed to create over the last decade or 2 decades in the service of sustainable development and in the service of promoting the rule of law. And I know that the United Nations has 2 levels when it comes to its approach towards the rule of law and promoting the rule of law, one on the international level and the other one on the national level. When it comes to the international level, my question is, how do you evaluate the current state of affairs when it comes to the ability of the international community to intervene and to contribute to conflict resolution, and where do you see the weakness points and where we have to move forward and to develop further the capacity of international community when it comes to applying the rule of law and try to reform the international organizations and especially the United Nations to make it more capable of playing a role in terms of conflict resolution. And my second question goes to Mr. Jeffrey from the South Africa experience, and I apply it, I try to think of my region, the Middle East, where so many conflicts have been arising throughout the last 5 or 6 years. When it comes to transitional justice and rebuilding, if you want, the social justice between the state and the people in the transitional justice phase, usually there is this, if you want, choice between the top-down and the bottom-up approach. And usually we have this issue of representation, you know, because in this stage, the voice of the people is very important for any peace agreement to sustain. So the challenge that is being faced by so many countries in post-conflict stages right now is how to make sure that any agreements and any arrangements in the transitional justice phase is really representing the will and the wish of the people, especially when there is regional interests, especially when there are parties around the table, negotiating table, that are representing more the interest of the regional powers than the interest of the local people. Thank you.
Any more questions? And then I will ask Mr. Hochschild and Mr. Jeffries to answer them in one go. Yes, Fred Husband.
Fred Houston from IDLO, and I'm a country director in Central Asia. One observation, I guess, in the work that we do is that in response to some of your comments about the gap between practice and theory, and your comments about the fact that you're very proud about some of the homegrown remedies and resolution of very difficult issues, makes me think a lot about what we're trying to do as IDLO to try to encourage the maximum use of any resources available to literally to focus attention on decision-making processes themselves, the study of the practice locally by local experts, because we also recognize that there's resentment from foreigners coming in and trying to tell them what to do. And we also find that this method of trying to marshal resources to encourage not only government employees and judges and prosecutors to analyze their own practices and come up with some ideas about how to improve them, but then also encouraging the civil society actors that are barely growing and barely even getting access to the knowledge of what those decision-making processes are. You know, we focus on publishing judicial decisions as a key foundational effort to try to allow more players to participate. Do you think that's the right approach? What do you think?
Dr. Mutwa.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a question for Mr. Jeffrey. Mr. Jeffrey, there was a lot of hope and enthusiasm for a better South Africa in the 90s, in the late 90s, and partly up to the early 2000s. I think you'll agree with me that that much of that hope was misplaced, because there have been some difficult times in the last 20 years in South Africa. There's a critique about the method of change that South Africa adopted to get to the deeply embedded social inequities that were present during apartheid. And one of those critiques was really about the law itself. That the law is to blame for what has not happened in South Africa, that it's very difficult to use the law always to bring about social change, that too itself is limited because of its nature. And I wonder whether you would reflect on this question and perhaps talk about what are the tools of social change beside the law that you think could have done a better job.
Thank you for all the questions, and now I would like first Mr. Jeffries and then Mr. Hochschild to respond. You can respond to any of the questions, not only those addressed to you.
Okay. Look, as far as the first question on the capacity, building the capacity of the judiciary, not too much as far as I recall, but one of the changes that's been brought in, but it took some time to bring it in, was the establishment of an independent judicial education institute for the training of judicial officers. So it's run by a council headed by the Chief Justice. It has other role players on the council, one of whom is myself. But the idea of, okay, if you've got an independent judiciary, government shouldn't be involved in their training, but at the same time, and in the beginning it was also quite difficult to convince judges that they needed training, that they needed new mindsets and so on. So I think that's the main innovation as far as the capacity for of the judges, specifically providing for training that's independent training. To my sister from Mozambique, yes, both our countries have strong parties. In South Africa, though, everything is subject to the courts, basically all action, and the courts regularly strike down the actions of government, and sometimes even the actions of the ruling party. Corruption is a big problem. There have been various efforts to establish frameworks, regulations for example, public tenders, which have created a lot of bureaucracy, but haven't necessarily solved the problems. But I think one of the important elements with South Africa, and it also relates to a later question, that transparency is very important, and South African society is very transparent, and if there isn't transparency, the courts will enforce it and ensure that there is transparency. We haven't had a problem of elections not being recognized or accepted as there has been as there was in Mozambique. One of the processes may have been that, again, there's stakeholder involvement in the elections. So there's a structure called a Party Liaison Committee, which operates at a national level, a provincial level, and a local level. Parties are encouraged to have party agents present during the voting and during the counting, so people can see things happen. If there are disputes, they are then referred to a specially established electoral court, which is also appointed by the Judicial Service Commission, and that court is recognized. And there have been some problems more at a local government level where there have been problems with, for example, municipal by-elections. So I'm not sure in Mozambique, we can maybe speak about afterwards whether you've copied or whether there's anything to learn from this party liaison committee role, because if you involve the parties, and everything is done at a voting district level, so the country is broken up into smaller voting districts. Each voting district has a voting station. There are party agents there. The voting takes place there, the counting takes place there, and everybody has the results from that. But I'm not sure. On the issue, the question from the member from Jordan, look, I mean, we were lucky in the sense of less regional involvement and pressure in our conflict. We did not have a referendum on the process. As I said, we had an inclusive process involving the parties. Not all parties were there. Some smaller parties pulled out or started participating and then pulled out at a later point, but they were relatively small. But effectively, the first election was, I guess, the referendum, and it was then that elected body that was going to craft the final constitution, but it was curtailed by constitutional principles that had been agreed upon by the smaller multi-party or the multi-party negotiating forum. So it wasn't a blank check to write a constitution. And in that constitution-making process, there was a lot of resources, a lot of energy put into ensuring public participation. So currently, sort of 20 years on, there's a bit of a different narrative coming out, or some people are attempting a different narrative, that it was an elitist document, but I don't agree with that. It was a very inclusive constitution-making process, and a lot of energy put into that. But yes, obviously we've had other examples. I mean, Kenya's history was, at least with the first new constitution, an effort to draft a new constitution and then to put that to the people, and then only to find it gets rejected, and the result then is conflict at the next election. So it's a difficult issue. On the last question, look, I think I mean, one of the other features of the South African conflict was there was no surrender. You had a party in power which was willing, or seeing that it could not continue in power, and it needed to make concessions. I think they made more concessions than they intended to, but there was no march of victorious troops from Umkhonto Wesizwe or Apla through the streets of Pretoria. So it had to be give and take. I don't, in the beginning, some of us were a bit concerned that when the Constitutional Court was established to adjudicate on the whole Constitution, but particularly on the Bill of Rights, that it was more privileged groups that were bringing cases to the Constitutional Court to say that their rights were being violated. Subsequent to that, there's been a shift in terms of the law is being used very often and very regularly as a means to enforce social justice and social change by disadvantaged groups. So I don't think it's fair, or I'd want to engage more on well, I disagree with the point that the law is to blame, and the law is being and can be used as a mechanism of social change. But as far as evaluating what are the tools, the biggest problem with South Africa is the question of racial wealth inequality. There were at the times, and I think it was a proposal from the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that there should be a wealth tax, which unfortunately was not accepted by government. But I do think that a lot more, well, ordinary South Africans could have contributed more to ensuring more energetic, more vigorous redressing of the imbalances of the past, rather than leaving it up to government. The land problem, the land issue rather, is a big issue. It was something that the representatives of white South Africans were particularly concerned about, ensuring a property clause that would ensure that there wasn't expropriation without compensation. Personally, I think that there have been more problems with the implementation of land redistribution rather than the laws themselves. It's more how they were implemented, and there probably could have been better ways of doing it. But I think it's something I don't know if I don't want to hog the floor, but it's something I would be interested in engaging with you more on if the opportunity arises.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries. Knowing Professor Mutwa, I'm sure he would be more than eager to engage with you outside. Fabrizio Hopschild.
Thank you, Director General. The delegate of Jordan asked how the international level one could become more effective in support to the rule of law and in conflict resolution. I think first it should be stressed is that what the international community can do, I think, is always complementary and an add-on to national efforts. I think in something that it goes so much to the heart of a nation, so much to the heart of a country as the rule of law. It is national initiatives that will have to prevail, and what the international community can contribute is modest, and I think recognizing that is an important starting point. Having said that, I think there have been critical initiatives. I'm thinking, for example, in Guatemala, the role played by the CICIG, which is an international prosecutorial capacity that supports national efforts and functions under national law, or what I mentioned before, the special criminal court that's been set up in CAR, which again is a mixed capacity, national and international, but functioning within the national judicial system. And I think especially where there are questions where you may need some method of making the judiciary more resilient to pressures, political pressures, or pressures of corruption, having for a transitory period, time-limited period, some sort of international capacity to support it can be important. I think a lot of the reforms the Secretary General is doing are aimed at making the UN more effective and faster. We are too often hampered by our administrative procedures that can just mean that, in very practical terms, it takes us weeks to deploy experts when they're needed overnight. I remember in the case of the Kenya peace process in, I think, 2005, where Kofi Annan was very engaged. He turned for an advisor on transitional justice to an NGO as opposed to the UN, and I think part of it was just the swiftness of deployment times. So if we want to do better, we cannot come with so much prohibitive administrative baggage, and that is a large part of the Secretary General's reform effort. Another is just seeing the world in a more joined up way. Currently, the Office for Rule of Law Issues is actually part of the peacekeeping department, and it struggles to provide support to country teams or to places where there isn't a peacekeeping operation, because strictly speaking, its mandate is limited to support to peacekeeping operations, and of course that makes no sense. But in the reforms that are being undertaken in the architecture of the peace and security in New York, the cooperation across all forms or in all countries, regardless of the type of the presence for that office, should become easier. And then on conflict resolution, I mean, I think conflict resolution, as the number of conflicts has grown, as conflicts have grown more intractable, as the number of actors have grown, as conflicts have grown more regional, has grown much more complicated. And the Secretary General also envisages a series of measures, including the recruitment of a high-level panel that I think is meeting this week for the first time, to a high-level mediation panel to support him better in conflict resolution efforts. And I think there'll also be more investment by the UN in national capacities at a local level on conflict resolution. So we are trying to do better through a whole series of measures. But ultimately, especially in the rule of law, I think it will be national efforts that are defining and finding the right formula to support those that always will be situation specific, I think is key.
Thank you very much for your response. Now I'm going to turn to some of the other panelists, and first to the Ambassador of Afghanistan, Wahid Omar. You're, of course, a former communications director, so I know you will be very sharp and succinct in your response so that we can have more of a conversation with you about the situation in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is a country where IDLO, my organization, has been there now for more than a almost 2 decades, since 2002. And there are many other organizations like that, enormous investment by the international community. So tell me, where do you think institution building stands in Afghanistan? What are the barriers to establishing the rule of law, despite all our best efforts, both on the national side and on the international side?
Thank you very much, Madam Director General. It's as with a lot of enthusiasm, I heard the story of South Africa, and when that story was being told, I thought that's a simpler story than to what I'm going to be talking about. As you know, in 2001, we emerged from a situation, a 40 years war, and then followed by a 5 years despotic regime where very basic rights of people were not met, and where justice was a far cry for anyone, for men, women, children, or anyone. As we started to form a new government, the choice was to we were forced to make a choice between either choosing justice, whether in the form of transitional justice or in the form of justice, or political stability. We had to make a choice, whether we were going to have a broad-based government, which would then ensure political stability, inclusiveness, and diversity, or whether we were going to pursue a robust justice and transitional justice procedure. And our international partners thought it was best for us at that time that we choose political stability and a broad-based government. As was said in the speech by our colleague from the UN, like Kosovo and like the East Timor, the justice capacity to deliver justice was not prioritized. There were two reasons for that. One was that the UN and our international partners thought the situation was too fragile to prioritize justice. And then there was also this mindset that Afghanistan is a tribal country. There are lots of informal ways of delivering justice, and people in Afghanistan will react to any effort to introduce proper, modern, formal justice. But a couple of years into the transition, we soon realized that all roads to political stability, to security, to economic development, to anything that we were aspiring at that time for went through justice and rule of law. That was the bottom line. There was no way we could make any progress on any, including democracy and our democratic institutions. There was no way we were going to make any progress on any front without prioritizing justice and rule of law. And that's when we started. I remember I managed, at a very young age, I managed the process of a public education campaign for the Constitution of Afghanistan when we were building the new Constitution. And part of it was also asking people as to what was their 3 priorities in the next Constitution to be stressed in the Constitution. And we delivered 3 million questionnaires to people, and the response was staggering. Almost everyone in their answers stressed that their number 1 priority was justice, access to justice, and rule of law. So then we started focusing more with a lot of support from international community, and specifically from our friends in Italy who were leading the process of rule of law, the rule of law support program, to try to prioritize rule of law and justice. We made a transition in 2001, and only in 2006 and 7 we started to put more support and more money and more technical support into developing proper civilian police for Afghanistan. Between 2001 and 2007, developing civilian police who would provide the basic rule of law for Afghanistan did not become a priority. And then we also started turning towards our developing our judicial system, the capacity building in the judicial system, the training in the for not only for our judicial system but also for our prosecutor's office, and also started programs that would help people's access to justice. Because one of the biggest problems we face in Afghanistan post 2001 was because the justice system in Afghanistan and the prosecutor's office in Afghanistan, during the 40 years of war, even before that, since we had royal governments in Afghanistan, these institutions did not project the kind of image that people wanted them to project. They projected force, they projected fear for people. So one of the challenges in Afghanistan was, how do you make sure that when you talk about the prosecutor that we call Saranwal, that people are not taken aback, that people are not afraid, that people are not scared? How do you talk about police to people and still and convince people that police is there to provide them rule of law and support? Because the police had always been used against them. The Attorney General's office was used against them, and even the judicial system was used against the people as opposed to providing them the service. So that was the main key issue. I think we have made quite some progress in these areas. Since 2007, we now have a police, we now have a civilian police. Unfortunately, there is a confusion within the police as to whether their first job is to fight against terrorism or to provide civilian protection for civilian population. There is that confusion because we are actively in war, and even when I talk about post-war countries, I'm not very sure whether we can call ourselves a post-war country. So in the police, while there is a lot of positive development, but there's also this confusion. Our police requires more support, more training in terms of giving them a proper understanding of what their role is when it comes to dealing with civilian population, on top of course, the counterterrorism activities that they are involved in. We have had some quite robust reforms process in the prosecutor's office and the Attorney General's office, as you know, Director General. There has been a lot of, we have managed to somewhat restore trust in the Attorney General's office by bringing robust reforms, by bringing a new young generation of people who are disconnected from the past, from the times of conflict and war, and who are educated and who know the new concepts of human rights and women's rights and everything else that we need for an attorney and for a prosecutor. And by also making the process of the reforms more transparent. So we have, I have seen it personally that when there is political will in any country, in Afghanistan, when there was political will to do a certain thing, then it can happen. And that thing has happened in our Attorney General's office lately. If you ask me about challenges, Director General, I'll still believe that lack of prioritization of rule of law is still a challenge. It's not that easy to get the international community to support a rule of law program as opposed to a program which deals, for example, with security or anything else. Restoring the trust is still a big issue. we still have a long way to go to tell people that a government is not there to project power, and that the judiciary and the Attorney General's office and the police are not there to scare you. They are not there to actually to project their power or on their own population. That's something we need to do a lot more work. And also, I have to admit that we have the corruption issue, though there have been steps taken, very strong steps taken in trying to tackle corruption. But corruption, as some of my other colleagues from a country like us, from a post-war war country, would understand, corruption is a multifaceted, a very complex issue, and dealing with it requires also a multifaceted, complex strategy. So that still is an issue, and where the international community can support us, we believe that we have made that transition from building a judiciary system and a rule of law and justice system. It is there now. Institutions are there now. We have capacity, we have human capacity in there now. There is a connection between the people in the judiciary system. Make no mistake, the people of Afghanistan do not believe in informal justice system. When they are provided with formal justice, they have always taken the formal justice more seriously. So this mindset is exaggerated when there are reports that people of Afghanistan, a certain percentage of people of Afghanistan, like informal justice system to formal justice system. Now, that's not true. They do go to informal justice system as a last resort, or when they are forced to, or when they do not have access to formal, but they do not prefer informal justice system. So we have the institutions, we have a certain capacity, and we have the political willingness, the three aspects of it. But what we would need in terms of support, as you, IDLO, has been rightly focusing on, is to train us and to advise us and to equip us with the capacity that we need to deliver better justice, and to also help us try to restore people's trust in our institutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your very candid and interesting analysis of how far Afghanistan has come over the years and where you stand now. Thank you very much for that. Let me now turn to the Attorney General of Somalia. And you, the Ambassador of Afghanistan, mentioned that the people of Afghanistan are interested in formal justice systems. That's where they want to be, but sometimes they may be forced to resort to informal systems. Now, in Somalia, as you know, Mr. Attorney General, we, IDLO, but also the international community, has been looking at traditional dispute resolution mechanisms as a way of rehabilitating former combatants, as a way of healing wounds, social healing processes. As Attorney General, what is your assessment of this approach to informal or traditional systems in Somalia? Do you believe they are helpful? To what extent?
Thank you, Mr. Director General, Mr. President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here to participate in this conference. I mean, this important assembly, and wish to be a successful one. I would also like to appreciate for opportunity to give me to speak for the audience. As all of us, we know that is in Somalia, it has been civil war for the last year. I mean, I'm not saying decades, but I'm saying quarter century, or 25 years or more, has been civil war. And before that also, when it comes to the judiciary area, it looks like neglected area until the independence age. So for that background of this, in Somalia, the traditional dispute resolution, when it comes to your question, it's a model development justice in our society. And we have also some call it in Somalia hair. That means the local laws that people going to the elders and they solve their problems. Its informal means have probably existed forever. They were certainly around well before the modern formal justice. And we know until today even, people are going everywhere. These informal mechanisms are so deeply entrenched in my country, and they continue to play the significant part in people's lives, dealing with everything, including property disputes, and also marriage, divorce, inheritance, all these issues. People are interested to go with TDR or traditional dispute resolution. In fact, I can say more than 80% of disputes may be resolved through this means in Somalia right now. This is simply because customary justice systems are easily accessible and affordable. And also, when you compare the distance and costs related to formal justice system, and in times of disaster or conflict, when the formal justice system is not operational, there may be no other options. That's only the way they can go, people, and solve their disputes. Informal justice also is a system frequently dependent on mediation, reconciliation, and consensus also. However, as you know, some of practices customary justice are against international laws and also international human rights. But as Office of Attorney General, when it comes to the Office of Attorney General, how you look at it's increasingly that is the office now is getting, especially when it comes to serious crimes. We're not going that far to the TDR, like rape cases, like murder case, all those issues. We're not preferring to go to the traditional dispute resolution or a transition or something like that. That is the reason that Somali federal government, through the Minister of Justice, has developed a policy on the adoption and the application of HER. That means we have a policy that accepted TDR or traditional dispute resolution. And also, as you mentioned, IDLO also supported that. Judiciary, my office, and other justice actors have been consulted on this policy. And we are now addressing the shortcomings of HER, and this mechanism is important for access to justice. So in Somalia, we have maybe different than other countries. We have a deep culture that accepted for this TDR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Attorney General. I think we've had two very interesting presentations on two countries which are very much, if I can put it this way, conflict affected, very fragile, difficult, extremely difficult operational environment on the ground. Both of them actually, incidentally, happen to have a lot of Italian involvement and support. So I see Italy sitting between the two of you, and that struck me. But let me open it up to others to comment on it. How do you see this discussion we've had about informal justice and the formal justice systems, and how countries that are emerging from conflict can deal with justice? In Afghanistan, for example, we have been very saddened to see how often courts have been bombed and attacked by the Taliban, precisely because the justice system was working and people were being prosecuted, the terrorists were being prosecuted and brought to justice. So in a sense, there's a lot of pressure on justice in many of these countries. It's not theoretical at all. It's a very real security situation there. So may I open the floor for a few questions, and if we'll take them together, and I will ask the two panelists to respond. Do I see any hands going up?
I think we have been clear enough.
Yes. Yes, no. I see a lady at the end of this panel, actually this side of the room, who is ready to ask you, and who also, I think, is coming from Afghanistan, and therefore I'm sure will have some questions for you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I'm from Afghanistan, IDLO office, and I just wanted to share something that has worked well in Afghanistan. It's been for us to implement our laws and as well as moving forward the justice sector has been one of the things. I don't know if this is also true in Somalia and other countries, but we have been very successful in building networks and coalitions, which has been very key, especially from bringing civil society and government stakeholders together to move forward some of the challenges and to overcome some of the barriers that we have. We have built networks within our legal aid organizations, for example, as well as within civil society to support gender-based violence. These networks and coalitions have been working very closely with government actors and stakeholders, which have in turn been very successful in helping implementation of the laws and overcoming some of the barriers. The coordination work that we have done in Afghanistan has been simultaneous with the courts as well as with the police, with the prosecution office, and representation of the ministries and the provinces. And these coalitions and coordination efforts have been instrumental in overcoming some of the barriers that are faced within the justice sector. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the engagement of civil society and coalitions in terms of justice sector, if there's any comments.
I see a hand at the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Shira Jama. I manage the Somalia program, IDLO Somalia program. I think there are a couple of issues I wanted to comment on, one of which is the presentation, the earlier presentation about the administrative linkages between peace building, state building, and also rule of law. The international community, especially in New York and other places, there's an enormous amount of ink that has been spilled on this matter. But when you look at these transitioning states where building of state building and peace building the international community is engaged in, that rhetoric or these academic journals that come out doesn't necessarily translate in reality. And I will give you an example. In Somalia, where the international community is engaged in reviving the state and building those institutions, even though when we come together and discuss those issues, what becomes very clear is the paltry amount of investment that goes into rule of law in institutions in comparison to security. And one wonders, for example, I'll give you the example. In Somalia, last year, about $1.5 billion went into security sector reform, whereas on the justice sector, the amount was 15 million. So even if we are successful in building the security sector, which I think would not necessarily contribute the state building, which is the obvious goal there, what sort of a state are we trying to build here? A police state? Because if we don't have these institutions, the rule of law institutions, then we're actually contributing negatively to the revival of the state. So I think this is something we ought to think about. The second point I want to mention is the application of customary justice in our country. As the Attorney General mentioned, I think we might be a little bit more different than Afghanistan in this regard. The customary justice have always been applied since the independence of the country in 1960. The first constitution recognized it, and throughout the constitutions that exist, up to the one that is now in force, the application of customary law is well enshrined. So those are the sort of observations I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Yes, please, Sudan.
Thank you, Madam Director General. I remember in one of our discussion in IDLO, I raised a point saying that we have to make use of the local leaders or religious leaders. I said that our communities, they don't accept solutions coming from outside. If you tell them, this IDLO told you to do this and not this, he said no. It is outside solution, we don't want it. I said we have to ask these people, what does your book say, your holy book, your religion, whatever it is? What does it say in terms of human rights, women empowerment? For example, in Islam, Prophet Muhammad said that women look like a glass or glasses. So take care of them, don't drop them to be broken. This is in favor of women empowerment. Another thing, if you kill one person, and if you kill all people, people get afraid. I was told this method was implemented in Afghanistan. I'm not sure of this. I was told by IDLO members. And I believe it is very effective, where these people believe that these solutions came from their own religion, beliefs, and whatever. And it is very effective, I think. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sudan. You've put a provocative idea out here about people's beliefs, customs, religious ideas, religious leaders. What role can they play in developing justice systems and justice principles? I'm looking for others who might want to comment on that. I think considering that we are sitting in a secular state, but with a neighboring religious state just down the road, that may be something to think about. What role do customary beliefs play in development? We talk about local ownership. We talk about aligning ourselves, participation, partnership, and so on. To what extent, and how do we resolve the dilemmas of international principles, international law, and the national state systems? Would anyone like to answer that, or perhaps other issues? Yes, please, Ambassador, go ahead.
Okay, just a couple of interventions. I think the point about civil society networks, if I didn't stress it enough, I'm sorry for that, but I think it's been one of the key strengths of the justice delivery system, especially when it comes to the awareness-raising part. It's been playing a very important role, including the activism on social media. It's hard in today's Afghanistan to do something illegal or to do something which is to do something bad and then to avoid the shame that you would face on social media. It's very hard. So civil society, women networks, and social media activism and civilian journalism, they all have had, they play a lot of role in. I think both the government in Afghanistan and the people are very well aware of that. In terms of, I made a point earlier before the Mr. Attorney General about customary justice, informal justice. I'm not saying that informal justice is a strange idea in Afghanistan, but what I'm saying is that sometimes it is, we exaggerate people's tendency to go to informal justice. One is the reality on the ground. Yes, the reality on the ground is a lot of people do go to informal justice and customary justice, but then if you ask them whether that is their first choice, you will find out that it's not their first choice. They go there because we fail to provide them with formal justice. And in terms of religious leaders, Somalia, Afghanistan, Sudan, we have, including Pakistan, our neighbor, and Iran, we have this common thing where religious leaders have a big role to play in the societies. And I think that is an opportunity, and also in some cases it is also a hurdle in the way you try to deliver justice. I think that people do recognize, also governments, my government does recognize the fact that tribal leaders, religious leaders, they have a role to play. They are people to whom people look when they have a problem. But then we also have to make sure that we do not overstretch the mandate that we provide to religious leaders, because that can then also become a hurdle in front of delivering justice. Thank you.
I think these are all very interesting, provocative questions. And at this stage, I would like to turn to Mona Rishwami from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, both in terms of human rights and gender equality issues. How do justice systems handle it? What is this balance, involvement of local customs, traditions, and systems? So Mona. And then we will have, I hope, more questions and comments from the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Director General. Thank you, IDLO, for having us here. I just want to actually comment on some of the things that I heard, particularly from the point of view of my own experience in working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but also in a number of countries, including Somalia, including Sudan, Afghanistan, and a number of countries which are represented here. The first point I want to make is on the issue of ownership. Whose ownership it is? When there is a problem in the country, when there is a conflict, it means that this, if you want, the social contract has broken down. So it means that there is a problem, that there is lack of trust in state institutions. To come back and build this trust is not really an easy issue. So when we speak about local ownership on this, and it's very important to make sure that we decide who is it that owns what. Is it certain communities? Is it certain societies? And where does this leave the victims of human rights violations? Because then often in most, particularly in internal conflicts, the conflicts are often along ethnic and religious lines. So what you find is that there is one community who's basically, the balance is not right. There is imbalance in the relationship. And that puts a big onus on the new institutions, on the states, or in the case of Somalia, is it tribes, is it certain communities? So to me, we have to be very careful about concepts such as, you build things from the bottom up, because you need the top down, and the top down means leadership. Whether the top down, is it the leadership of the government itself, or is it the values that the government itself that puts forward, whether it is a new government and so on, that's really very important. Especially when it comes to justice. And I want to link that to another issue, which is really important in terms of human rights. I believe very strongly is that we are in an age where every single one of us is accountable. So we are in an age of accountability. Whether we are accountable in the context of a justice system and in formal justice systems, criminal justice is one thing, but whether we are also, there is social media, there is also, there is a huge demand out there, civil society, there is a huge demand out there for transparent and accountable government. So it's not only the justice system, but it's the bigger picture that puts us all in accountability. And that really places the individual at the center of what we are doing, what one is doing, whether it is the actor or the receiver. So it's really interesting at this stage that there isn't a country in the world that is not party to at least 2 human rights treaties. At least 2. So states think that having a human rights treaty that you are party to is actually helpful because it strengthens your framework in which you can actually govern, and it clarifies what are the rules of the governments. And I want to bring this to the point that Irene was, the Director General was asking about in terms of gender equality. I was very happy to hear that, for example, in the traditional dispute resolution that you have, you are not including cases such as rape and I was a bit, sir, I didn't know how to take the comment about women that you just made. I didn't really know how to take that because I think the way to, I don't think we can really at this age of day look at particularly the gender-based crimes in a way that we are looking at a cop. It's different. I think it's very different. I think breaking a human being in terms of gender-based violence is really, really serious. And we have to be careful not to take concepts that were done in absolute good faith at a different era and bring it to the modern era today. We'll have to take what the essence of it. The essence of it is that you cannot commit violence on other human beings. You have to treat every single person with dignity and respect, and that includes both men and women and includes both genders. And I agree with you that it is very important at this stage to say, okay, there are issues that are so serious that we cannot leave it to customs and traditions. The state has to step in. Because if the state doesn't step in, someone else will step in, and there will be international accountability at a different level. And this, I mean, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on. And sexual-based violence are one of them when they are rampant and they are systematic in society. So what I wanted to say now at this stage, we have institutions at the national level, we have institutions at the regional level, we have institutions also at the international level that basically make the thread for this accountability, the rule of law, the respect for human rights, the respect for dignity and all, links it all together to allow us all to basically achieve something very concrete in the area of the rule of law and so on. So we do not have to debate the concepts again and go back to things that are tried, and I don't know, maybe succeeded in certain contexts, but also maybe did not succeed in other contexts. The big phase, and this is my last point, the big phase that we are in, and this is really perhaps is the biggest success of the development project in the last few decades, is that the majority of people in the world are educated. We have compulsory minimum education. The majority of people in the world are educated. The majority of people of the world know their rights. The majority of people in the world claim their rights, and they want to. The issue of leadership is that whether we have the institutions and the frameworks to provide that, and that's where I think IDLO's role becomes extremely important, and to bring rule of law and development together and help us go through this maze of how do we actually ensure the dignity and respect for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mona, for your strong and passionate speech. I was always, I always save the best for the last, and therefore the two women. The next, I would like to invite the Honorable Najat Ben Salah, who is the Avocat General and Council of the Ministry of Justice in Tunisia, to bring your perspective on the debate. You've had the advantage of listening to everyone, and you will now have the possibility to respond with your thoughts on it. And after that, we will open it up very briefly for 1 or 2 questions. So please choose your questions carefully and be ready for that. Please.
Merci, Madame la Directrice. Excellences, honorable assistance, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi aujourd'hui de prendre part à cette honorable assemblée. Et je suis ravie parce que vous avez laissé au fait 2 femmes à la fin. Et j'ai une histoire justement avec cette femme et je veux la partager avec vous. Monet est une grande militante des droits de l'homme, est une grande dame que je n'oublierai jamais. J'ai assisté avec elle en tant que magistrate en Tunisie dans les débuts des années 90 dans un cycle de formation en fait, qui était dédié aux magistrats en matière de renforcement des capacités des juges tunisiens en droits de l'homme. Et à la fin, donc, on a terminé la session, on a beaucoup appris d'elle et de ses collègues. Et puis, moi, j'ai accouché le dernier jour du cycle de formation et après, j'ai entendu dire qu'il y a eu un accrochage avec le gouvernement, donc l'équipe de Monet, et depuis, je pense, elle a été interdite de séjour en Tunisie. Et aujourd'hui, on se retrouve dans le même panel. Et j'avais une soif dans les différentes interventions parce que je n'ai pas beaucoup entendu sur les problématiques des femmes lors des conflits. Je n'ai pas beaucoup écouté sur les questions de genre et de l'importance aussi de l'approche genre dans les politiques et de le rétablissement de la paix. Et je rappelle que la résolution 1325, justement, des Nations Unies, donc, mais avant même que l'agenda donc 2015-2030 soit élaboré, donc il y a eu pas mal de travail, justement, sur ce point et sur l'importance donc de prendre en considération donc la question surtout des violences faites aux femmes. Et là donc je vais parler de mon pays, la Tunisie. Ce petit pays qui en 2011 a surpris le monde entier donc par sa révolution. Je dis bien surpris, pourquoi ? Parce que les indicateurs économiques ou même politiques ou autres, au fait, n'étaient pas au plus bas. Donc, par exemple, sur le plan économique, la Tunisie était un pays émergent. Donc, les indicateurs économiques n'étaient pas mal. Sur le plan politique, il y avait une légère participation, donc disons des partis politiques, mais pas une participation politique libre, disons. Elle est un peu dirigée et opprimée par le pouvoir en place. Un statut de la femme qui a été toujours vanté dans le monde arabe, donc assez avancé, mais par rapport donc au monde, donc pas mal de droits et l'émancipation de la femme tunisienne. Je suis sûre vous en connaissez donc du moins l'histoire et les origines. Donc tous ces ingrédients en fait ne donnaient pas de raison, disons, à la révolution tunisienne. Et du coup, le 14 janvier 2011, donc il s'est passé ce qui s'est passé, donc l'effondrement du régime en place. Pourquoi je rappelle ces faits? Parce que justement, c'est pour vous dire que c'est pas toujours, disons, le développement économique sans un état de droit n'est pas viable. Mais le contraire est aussi juste. C'est-à-dire, ce qu'on a vécu après la Révolution, c'était, disons, le contraire de ce qu'il y avait. Donc une liberté d'expression, une émancipation encore plus accentuée de la population en général, y compris de la femme, un processus politique réussi, mais le développement économique a été beaucoup fragilisé et donc du coup, ce qu'on a remarqué, c'est une montée de l'extrémisme, donc montée de la violence, une marginalisation, une volonté de marginalisation des femmes, notamment le leadership aussi, les femmes dans les postes de décision, Et donc, c'est un peu surprenant ce cours de l'histoire qui se renverse à chaque fois. Et donc, c'est pour vous dire que rien ne se fait sans l'autre. Un développement économique apparent, mais qui, au fond, ne prend pas en compte, qui n'est pas inclusif, qui ne prend pas en compte les besoins spécifiques, que ce soit des régions comme chez nous, parce que c'était ça, c'était un développement qui n'était pas, le modèle économique n'était pas inclusif. La somme des droits aussi n'est pas garantie pour tout le monde. Donc il y a des droits dans les textes, mais ce n'est pas garanti pour tout le monde. Donc une justice en partie asservie, etc. Donc le système n'est pas viable. Donc pour garantir une paix durable et un développement durable, il faut un préalable. Il faut des textes de loi, il faut un respect des droits et il faut aussi un développement économique. Parce que sinon les gens vous disent, écoutez, donc c'est notre quotidien en fait, c'est notre pain quotidien qui importe et pas c'est le droit à l'expression ou donc je ne vais pas manger à ma faim avec le droit à l'expression, et c'est ce qu'on répète maintenant, certains en Tunisie. Autre chose, c'est que dans ces transitions, ces transitions démocratiques, surtout même dans la période plutôt de consolidation de la démocratie, quand on commence au fait à bâtir les institutions comme en Tunisie, parce que nous avons élaboré une constitution d'une manière et avec un processus consensuel, et nous avons une constitution avant-gardiste. Et maintenant, nous sommes dans la phase justement de la construction des institutions durables. Bientôt, d'ailleurs, nous verrons la mise en place de la Cour constitutionnelle, qui, elle, au fait, est une garantie suprême, avec sa place donc dans la Constitution, de tous les droits énoncés dans la Constitution. Alors, par exemple, dans ce contexte, quand on parle des droits des femmes, et on a eu cet été, l'été dernier, un débat vraiment houleux sur ces questions-là, quand le Parlement a adopté la loi sur la violence à l'égard des femmes. Et c'est une loi vraiment très très importante et d'une avancée majeure dans le contexte et dans le corpus juridique tunisien. Mais surtout aussi suivi par l'annonce qui a été faite par le président de la République concernant la nécessité, du moins, d'amorcer le débat sur l'égalité sur l'héritage. Et là, donc, avec mon étonnement, même des personnes qu'on croyait avant-gardistes se posaient la question, oui, mais dans ce contexte, est-ce une priorité? Oui, est-ce une priorité? Du moins, la question a été posée. Donc, cette commission qui a été formée pour réfléchir sur la question a été beaucoup critiquée, comme quoi, bon, en fait, on veut masquer les difficultés que vive la société dans cette phase de transition et de consolidation de la démocratie avec des questions farfelues, entre guillemets, comme l'héritage ou l'égalité ou les lois sur la violence à l'égard des femmes, etc. Et qu'en Tunisie, ce n'est pas un problème, ainsi de suite. Bon, ça c'est une parenthèse que j'ai ouverte parce que juste pour compléter tout le débat qui a été fait. Mais je vais revenir aussi à la construction et l'engagement de la communauté internationale sur ces questions de l'appui au fait qu'on apporte et la vision parfois différente d'un pays à l'autre, d'une transition démocratique à l'autre, sur ce qui est prioritaire justement dans la construction démocratique et donc aussi le respect de l'état de droit. Et une remarque d'un intervenant, je crois, qui parlait de la Somalie, a attiré mon attention sur l'appui qu'on apporte beaucoup plus à les réformes de la sécurité plutôt qu'à la justice. Et je partage son avis. Je vous dis, c'est une grande erreur. parce que c'est ce que j'ai remarqué en Tunisie. Alors, après des années maintenant, si vous voyez les fonds qui ont été investis, disons, dans les... Ça ne veut pas dire qu'ils sont énormes, mais par rapport à ce qui a été donc investi dans la réforme de la justice, vous allez tout de suite voir la différence. Et ça continue. Or, c'est une erreur. Sécuriser le pays, c'est bien, donc réformer le secteur de la sécurité pour rétablir la confiance aussi du citoyen dans le système de la sécurité. Du moins, je parle en Tunisie. Je pense qu'un grand pas quand même a été accompli parce que maintenant, ça devient une revendication citoyenne. Hein. Donc, au fait, le citoyen, globalement, les politiciens, tout le monde s'est réconcilié avec la police. Et donc, au contraire, donc, c'est eux qui réclament maintenant plus de droits pour les policiers et disent, oui, on a besoin des policiers, il faut leur donner plus de droits, ils sont syndiqués, ils s'expriment librement, etc. Donc, au fait, on n'a pas vécu une grande crise avec le système de sécurité en Tunisie. Bon, mis à part, bien sûr, la menace terroriste, etc., à laquelle, au fait, même l'armée fait face, donc elle apporte aussi son appui à la police. Mais la justice, avec ses besoins énormes, et donc avec un processus de réforme qui est, à mon avis, inédit, parce que en pleine crise, un processus de consultation qui a englobé toute la Tunisie a été amorcé et une vision de quelle justice on voudrait a été donc formulée avec la participation de tout le monde, hein, les juges, les magistrats, les avocats, les citoyens, même les prisonniers, le personnel donc, du système carcéral. Donc tout le monde a participé à cette vision. Elle est là, tout le monde est d'accord, des plans d'action sont là, mais les ressources sont insuffisantes. Et c'est important. Donc parfois, même si on veut réformer, même s'il y a l'appropriation, même s'il y a toute la volonté du monde, les réformes ont du mal à arriver. Et dans un secteur aussi important que la justice, parce que les moyens manquent. Et donc il faut qu'il y ait, disons, plus d'engagement de la communauté internationale et plus d'investissement, parce qu'on ne peut pas parler d'état de droit, justement, et aujourd'hui, donc c'était la grande thématique, et je suis d'accord, donc l'importance de l'état de droit, dans la consolidation, dans le développement durable et dans la paix durable, sans qu'il y ait un grand investissement de la justice, parce que, par exemple en Tunisie, la lutte contre la corruption qu'on a engagée et un travail remarquable se fait, y compris à travers l'instance indépendante de lutte contre la corruption. Oui, mais il y a peu de magistrats pour ça. Donc, même si la volonté existe, l'infrastructure ne suit pas. L'informatisation n'est pas généralisée. On n'a pas un système sécurisé d'échange d'informations. Aussi, on n'a pas une justice, disons, où le numérique est central, parce que aussi, même dans la lutte contre la corruption, donc, on sait que le système informatisé réduit donc, énormément donc, la corruption. Donc, plus il y a moins de contacts entre le public et le personnel judiciaire, là où il y a moins de corruption. Je ne veux pas être longue, donc je suis à votre disposition si vous avez envie de poser plus de questions sur ce qui se passe en Tunisie, qu'est-ce qu'on est en train de faire. Et voilà, j'ai voulu toucher un peu à tout. Merci.
Thank you very much, Najat, for the strong and passionate statement that you made, and bringing it down to the reality of Tunisia. Now, if people in the audience are wondering why we chose to have the two women intervene at the end, towards the end of the session, is because tomorrow morning they will be the first ones. Tomorrow morning we have a panel on gender equality, and I hope you will participate in it, and we can probe some of these issues deeper. I think we have had a very interesting afternoon where we started with the global vision the strategic vision of the United Nations. And then we came down to the ground, national experiences. First, the history of what has happened, how it was handled in the past with Mr. Jeffrey's analysis of South Africa. And then coming to the present day, continuing problems in Afghanistan and Somalia, and the importance of recognizing the local context, very different context in Somalia and Afghanistan. The importance of partnership, inclusion varies from country to country, depending on the social, political context there. And of course, legal systems, the traditions, the values that have come up consistently. And then completing that discussion with the gender lens. The gender lens always throws a different perspective. And I think it is always valuable to see it from that perspective. So I think we've had a good roundup of what we wanted to talk about, and that is the huge challenge of building effective, accountable institutions. And if I may say so, it is not only a challenge in developing countries or in countries coming out of conflict or in fragile situations. As we heard from the message from the Minister of Justice of Italy, it is also a challenge for developed countries. So it is a challenge across governance and statehood. And what keeps that challenge going and pushes it towards resolution, improvement, is actually the power of citizens. Active, empowered citizens are very important in order to be able to have good, effective institutions. It's like supply and demand in economics. If you demand, if citizens demand, then you get the supply of justice. So I hope you have all enjoyed, and thank you very much for participating with the questions and comments in this debate. We will now have a break for coffee. We are running a little late, for which I apologize, but it was such an interesting debate with so many different perspectives that I'm afraid, as a facilitator, I've probably totally failed. But we take a break now for about 15 minutes. Coffee is outside, and then when we come back here, we will have another interesting discussion about economic development and the rule of law facilitated by Mr. Di Chiara. Okay, so thank you.